Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me for our class in the book of Numbers. We are in Numbers chapter 1. Last week we had our introduction to the book, and so now we are going to get more into the text. We recall that this is still set at the foot of Mount Sinai. And it's interesting to note, this is something that I realized, from the beginning of Exodus all the way to Deuteronomy, or really, I think even with Joshua, there's not an actual time lapse in between the books. Exodus to Leviticus, it's meant to be understood as happening that immediately following, and then Leviticus to Numbers is immediately following, and then Numbers to Deuteronomy is immediately following as well. So at least for those, and I'll have to look if Joshua is immediately following Deuteronomy or if there's some little time gap in between there. But it's interesting, those four books don't have any time gap between them. They are one continuous story that has no scene change from in between the beginnings and endings. Anyway, that was just an interesting thing that I had noticed while I was putting together this lesson. Numbers chapter 1, we are going to have God doing his business of getting the people of Israel ready to leave Mount Sinai. But he is going to need to do some things first to get them ready. Like I said, this is at the foot of Mount Sinai, obviously. Israel has been there for about a year now. You remember in Exodus 19:1, Israel arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai on the third new moon, is what the Bible says. The third new moon after leaving Egypt. So it was the middle of the second month, because the third full moon would have been the beginning of the third month. So the middle of it is the third new moon. I think that works out. Maybe not. I don't use that calendar, so I'm not exactly sure. So it is about the middle of the second month, coming up on a whole year of being at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they will have only 20 days to get ready to leave. Numbers 10 verse 11 is when they actually pack up and leave, and that is on the, I believe, the 20th day of the second month. So they are at the beginning of the second month. Yes, that is correct. That is what the timeline is looking at. They're at the beginning of the second month, and they have 20 days to get ready to go. So they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. Elsewhere it's called Mount Horeb, because Mount Horeb is the actual individual mountain. Not Horeb. Yes, Horeb. I'm thinking of a different mountain elsewhere. But they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. It's also called Mount Horeb. Sinai is the mountain range. Sometimes the range is referred to as a singular mountain because it's one mass of stone. And interesting, I found this out recently as well. The name Sinai is from the Hebrew word, I hope I'm pronouncing this right. I might have gotten the S or the SH confused, but it is the Hebrew word Sinai, which means thistle bush. So it's obviously referring back to when Moses encountered God in Exodus chapter 3 in the burning bush. they named the mountain after the bush that is on it. So it's Mount Thistle. It's an interesting thing to call it. Anyway, with only 20 days to get ready to leave for the promised land, it is time for God's people to get organized. First, God wants the people counted. He specifically wants the men older than 20 years old to be counted. All the men who could go to war. Numbering a nation's fighting men was a common enough thing in ancient times. For nations to hold together, right, they need to have confidence in the force that they can muster to protect themselves and protect their loved ones, right? Otherwise, why would you still be a part of a nation if you didn't believe that that nation could collectively protect its own, you know? So now this isn't to say that Israel was going to take Canaan by their own strength, the strength of their own hand, and so they needed to know for sure that they had the strength to do it. But God was going to give it to them. The Bible mentions that over and over again. They're not taking Canaan by the strength of their own hands, by their skill in battle, because Israel is not made up of trained fighting men. I say is not, but it today kind of is. But because in Israel you have to spend 2 years in the military. But it was not made up of trained fighting men. They were all shepherds, herdsmen. They were all also farmers. You know, so they're not skilled at war. It's not going to be them who is winning the land of Canaan, but God is going to give it to them. Let's keep that in mind. But God is going to have them do things. He's going to have them play their part. And part of that part is fighting battles. And in such, they were going to need that confidence. They needed to know, hey, we have a lot of men. We have a lot of fighters here. How much confidence would this numbering give them? Well, this is probably the only number in the whole first chapter of the book of Numbers that is probably worth remembering, and it is the total. You know, people look at the book of Numbers and they say, it's named Numbers, so that kind of implies that the most important thing is the numbering of the people. You don't have to memorize any of these numbers. If you're going to remember any one of these numbers, memorize like the last one. It's 603,550. That was the total number of fighting men in Israel at the outset of the book of Numbers. Now, what kind of a number is 603,550 fighting men? Well, in a time before really the age of supermassive empires, this is a big number. This is a very big number. And, you know, write this number down. We will revisit it at the end of the book because the people get numbered another time, and I want to, it's going to be an interesting experiment to compare the numberings. It's a lot of people. This was not yet the time of super massive, known world-spanning empires. Romans, Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, not yet. Egypt was the largest nation at the time, and their reach did not span across the Red Sea. They were not a huge empire, and they were the largest. And so with neighbors who could field at most 50,000 fighters at one time, I would say they should feel pretty confident with 600,000 fighting men. Even if they're not well trained, you know, they're not professional fighters, 600,000 is a lot compared to 50,000. The best anyone could hope to do against Israel would be to turn them away, to get them to give up on fighting. Israel over and over again worries about being destroyed if they went up against too strong of an opponent. And that's really ridiculous, because they have over 500,000 fighting men. And the only other people to raise like numbers of that are on the other side of the Himalayan mountain range. The Chinese could do that, but nobody in the Fertile Crescent region or the land of Canaan could muster nearly that many people. No one was going to destroy Israel. No one was going to annihilate them. The most anyone could ever hope to do against them would be to turn them away, make them stop wanting to fight. And that's really what makes Numbers 13 through 14 so painfully ironic. Because Israel had every reason to think, we could take these guys, and yet they let the worrying report of the 10 spies get the better of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That is 13 chapters away. After all of the people are numbered, God makes sure that Moses knows the Levites are exempt from the census, not because the number of Levites doesn't matter. In fact, they do number the Levites later, but because they're not going to be ones that go out and fight. Why? Because they already have a specific task that they are going to be given. The Levites specifically were tasked with keeping and guarding the tabernacle and all of the things that have to do with it. The way that it is phrased is that they were guarding it. They were more guarding it from the people of Israel than guarding it from any outside threat, which is interesting. It sort of harkens back to the holiness of God being a potentially dangerous thing, dangerous for people who are not authorized to be in such close proximity to it, especially if they're in an unclean state ceremonially. And so the Levites are camped around the tabernacle to keep people from just coming and touching what they're not supposed to, touching what would be dangerous for them to touch. And also, whenever the camp packs up to move, the Levites are the ones who will be carrying all of the things. And so they are charged with keeping and guarding the tabernacle, the furnishings inside the tabernacle, even the ark. When the camp is stationary, they're not moving, so the priests are not carrying the ark. The Levites guard the ark. You ever wonder why in the Gospels it seems like the high priest has his own personal army? He has like his own personal police force? That's the Levites. He was allowed to have that. God put the Levites in that place. That is the Levites other than the family of Aaron. The family of Aaron were the priests. And we call the tribe of Levi, we call it all the time, we call it the priestly tribe. And that is a misnomer. That's a misnomer, an undue naming, because not all of the Levites were priests. In fact, in the first generation of the Israelites who had this covenant with God, there were 5 out of 22,250 Levites were priests. And that is Aaron and his 4 sons. And of course, 2 of those sons died. Nadab and Abihu, you remember them. And so 3 out of 22,250 Levites were actually priests. I don't know about you, but I think that that ratio does not warrant the term priestly tribe. We call them the priestly tribe because the Levites are where the priests come from, or came from, pardon. But the vast majority of them were not priests. The vast majority of them were temple guard. They were the temple guard. The temple guard, if you want the history of them, what became of them, what became of the temple guard all perished in the siege of Jerusalem at the hand of the Romans in AD 70. They were the last people to be in the holy place before the Romans broke in. And the Romans threw fire into the holy place to try and smoke the rebels out, and the temple guard, the Levites, who were, they're like a police force or private military for the temple, they refused to leave, and instead of coming out and surrendering when they were being smoked out with the fire, they chose to remain, and they all perished. Kind of morbid, but it shows how seriously they took their duties as the guardians of the temple and the tabernacle and the ark and all of the things therein. The duties of them are explained in detail in chapter 3. We're not going to read all of those, but if you would like to, you will have a better understanding of how all of the groups of the Levites worked. There were, I believe it's that Levi had 4 sons, and each of these 4 sons became a clan, and those clans did certain tasks around the tabernacle. Then as we go into Numbers chapter 2, now that the fighting men are all listed and commanding officers have been appointed, it is time to arrange the camp properly. Yes, indeed, God never wanted his people to be an incongruous horde. He wants order for them. You remember what 1 Corinthians chapter 14 says about that? It says, let all things be done properly and in order. Let me actually read these verses to you. Verse 33 says, God is not a God of confusion, but he is God of peace. God never wanted his people to be a confusing and, can't really figure out what they're all about kind of people. They are to be distinct and they are to be ordered. Indeed, it says in verse 40, all things should be done decently and in order. Now, of course, 1 Corinthians 14 is in reference to when the church gathers for worship, but it is no coincidence that the word church, ecclesia, which means assembly, is the same word that the Septuagint used whenever the Old Testament talked about the nation of Israel as the congregation, the assembly. We call little local pockets of the Lord's church congregations all the time. You ever wonder where we get that word? It's from the Old Testament. It's what they called the nation of Israel. It's from the New Testament. That's what the word church means. And so God never wanted the congregations of his people to be messy, chaotic, or without form or order. He wants them to be ordered. He wants everything to be discernible about what it is about and what's going on. And when things are ordered, they run smoothly, and things are less likely to simply fall apart. That is why God made an order for how the church is supposed to be run, how it's supposed to have its governance. Jesus is at the head, and in each congregation there are supposed to be the elders who who oversee the congregation, who see to the spiritual needs of the congregation. And meanwhile, there are also the deacons who are supposed to do the sort of practical parts of the congregation, seeing to everyone's needs, the practical matters in that regard. And so the elders are sort of directional, figuring out the direction that the congregation's ministry needs to go in, and the deacons are the hands-on, leading the efforts kind of people. So anyway, that was a nice tangent. So the camp is then organized in the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. You get it? The 4 cardinal directions. On the east side, the tribe of Judah is in the lead, with Issachar and Zebulun joining them. The east side is the same side as the entrance to the tabernacle, and thus the altar, because the altar was sitting in the entrance to the tabernacle complex. And so it is a very important direction. That's the direction that the sun is rising, and when the sun rises, it rises on the priests who are doing their morning sacrifices to get themselves ready for their priestly duties for the day. It's very symbolic, you know. And that is the side that Judah is put in charge of. That is also symbolic, because who came from the tribe of Judah? The Christ, the Messiah. And I'm sure that played into the decision-making process that God had when deciding who is going to be on the east side, the most important side. Then on the south side, Reuben is in the lead with Simeon and Gad with him. The tribe of Reuben, that is. The south end of the Promised Land was supposed to be the first place that Israel entered into the Promised Land. God led them up to... Oh, I'm blanking on what the name of the place is. It is Kadesh Barnea? That might be the place. I'll look at it. But God leads them up to this place on the edge of the Promised Land, and He wants them to go up through it in the north. I don't know, I'm not seeing it. Anyway, I don't know. He wanted them to go up into the Promised Land through the north, and that would have taken them through the Negev, which is a highly fertile farmland, right up towards Jerusalem, which is a great place for a fortress. But instead, you know, you remember what happens in Numbers 13 and 14. They don't go in through the south entrance to the Promised Land. Instead, they circle around for like 40 years and go in through the east side of the Promised Land. Now, just as Reuben and Gad were the first to settle when they ended up entering on the east side of the Promised Land, perhaps they would have settled on the south side if they had done what God told them to do. So perhaps what God was going for was, you guys are going to be on the southern end of the nation, near the Dead Sea and below Jerusalem and that mountain range. Perhaps that's what He was going for, because they would have settled there first, just like how they ended up settling on the one side of the Jordan first when they went that way, and in reality, you know how it actually happened. So maybe they were supposed to settle in the south, because they would have gotten there in the south first, if they had just done what God told them to. It would have all made sense. But that's just my speculation. Then, after the east and south sides are put in order, the middle is straightened out. In the middle of them is going to be the tabernacle and the tent of meeting, and like I said, with the Levites camped around the tabernacle. And you can see the obvious symbolism here. God is at the center of the congregation of Israel. Just like he is supposed to be at the center of their hearts, at the center of everything in their life. We've talked about that in the book of Leviticus. He is at the center of their physical nation. And then on the west side of the camp is Ephraim in the lead, and Manasseh and Benjamin joining him. Now, all of these tribes, when Israel settles down, all of these tribes are west of the Jordan, but not south of the Dead Sea. So if you look at a map, they are west of the Jordan, and they're not south of the Dead Sea. So they're in the middle west of the nation of Israel. So they are really the western tribes. They're not in the north, they're not in the south, they're not in the east on the other side of the Jordan, they are smack dab in the west. And that matches what side they were on in the camp. Very neat detail. And then on the north side, there is the tribe of Dan at the lead, along with the tribes of Asher and Naphtali joining him. Asher and Naphtali were originally placed in the north. If you pull up a map of the nation of the tribes of Israel, you will see that Asher and Naphtali were both at the very northernmost parts of Israel, but Dan was placed in the southwest. Was placed in the southwest. However, when the Philistines pushed north into Israel's land, they displaced the tribe of Dan, and so Dan had to migrate from the southwest all the way up to the north. They're on the very northernmost part, at the very foot of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon. That's the one I was thinking I was confusing. Mount Horeb and Mount Hermon. They sound really similar. But Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is in the northern part of Israel. It separates Israel from Damascus, Syria, and Lebanon on the other side of that, on the coastal side. Syria and Damascus on the inland side. Mount Hermon separates them from those nations, and at the foot of Mount Hermon is Dan, after they had to migrate. So so it seems, Dan couldn't escape being on the north side. Interesting. That's why I speculated that these sort of the sides of the camp that they were placed on in the book of Numbers kind of corresponds to how they're supposed to have been laid out when the tribes went into the land of Canaan. And so like the south side with Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Simeon they didn't have any tribal lands. They were dispersed among the other tribes, especially Judah, which was in the south. But Reuben and Gad settled in the east, on the eastern side of Jordan, where they weren't supposed to go. They weren't supposed to settle there, but they decided to because, I don't know, they wanted to settle down first. That's why I said if they had gone in south like the Lord had told them, perhaps they would have ended up on the south side. Just like in the camp, they were on the south side. I don't know, all these things, all these little details, I feel like they lend some credence to my theory that they were supposed to be corresponding to where they would settle down. Anyway, that's just a theory, and because of the tribe's decision-making process, that's not how it ended up. So if it was supposed to be how it ended up, they saw to it that it didn't, so we'll never know. Then we get to Numbers chapter 3, and I already mentioned the duties of the Levitical families are laid out there in detail, and we're not going to talk about those. Those aren't especially interesting for this class. But what is interesting is the matter of the redemption of the firstborn. We've visited this topic before, especially when we talked about the Passover. God said, all of the firstborn males belong to me, whether they are your actual children, or they are firstborn of your livestock. They belong to me, the Lord, because I spared your firstborn in the land of Egypt when I sent the 10th plague, and because you followed my commands, you did not suffer that 10th plague. I passed over your firstborn. That's why they called it Passover. God said, those belong to me now, and you must redeem them. You must buy them back. But now in Numbers chapter 3, starting in verse 40, the Lord said to Moses, list all the firstborn males of the people of Israel from a month old and upward, taking the number of their names. Why a month old and upward? Because that month ago would have been the exact 1 year mark of when the Passover actually happened. Interesting. So every month old and upward, taking the number of their names, verse 41, and you shall take the Levites for me. I am the Lord, instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel, and the cattle of the Levites, instead of the firstborn among the cattle of the people of Israel. So Moses listed all the firstborn among the people of Israel, as the Lord had commanded him, and all the firstborn males according to the number of the names from a month old and upward, as listed, were 22,273. So there were 22,273 firstborn males in the nation of Israel. Meanwhile, verse 39, the section right before it, there are 22,000 even Levites. So if God is redeeming, He's going to take the Levites instead of taking the firstborn. There's still a deficit of 273 people. And so, because they're short 273 people, God tells him to put a price of 5 silver shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, for each head. And so those 5 shekels are taken for each remaining person, the 273, and those are given to the priests, obviously to put it in the treasury for the tabernacle. It's interesting to think, was it 273 just really unlucky families that had to pay the 5 shekels? Or did they kind of just sort of band together, they just sort of threw in their silver together to supply the 1,365 shekels of silver? That's an interesting thing to think about. Who knows? Maybe it was just 273 unlucky families, like they were the last ones for the census takers to get to, and they said, well, there's a deficit, we're going to need some of your money. But maybe they all threw their money together, and it didn't really cost one family that much. I don't know. But finally, Numbers chapter 4, the duties of the Kohathites are listed. The Kohathites are a certain family of the Levites, and they were arguably the most important family of Levites aside from Aaron's family. And I don't remember quite if Aaron's full lineage is ever given. He might have been a Kohathite. I don't exactly remember. But other than Aaron's family, which, like we mentioned, is the family that the priests actually come from, the Kohathites are the most important family. They were tasked with the most important tabernacle furnishings aside from the Ark of the Covenant itself. Whenever the camp was going to pack up and move, the priests themselves carried the Ark. But the bread, or the table of the bread of the presence, the altar, the basin under the altar, the lampstand, you remember the golden lampstand that we mentioned represented God's presence among the people as long as it was lit. The Kohathites are the ones that carried all of these extremely important tabernacle furnishings. And so they were an extremely important family. This is the same family that Korah is from. If you recall from Numbers chapter 16, Korah is one of the men who leads a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. I say one of the men who leads it. He is the man who leads it. He is the man who does it. He's the one. Korah the Kohathite is how he is referred to. He tries to usurp Aaron as the priest because, hey, we are already a really important family. Why should this family, that is literally just 3 guys, have all of this honor of being the priests? So they try and usurp Aaron, and of course, if you know how that story goes, you know it doesn't end well for Korah and his gang of mutineers. I don't know how to refer to them. Rebels, their lives are ended. And we're going to talk about that more in depth when we actually get to Numbers 16. And so, now that Israel has things in order, the camp is ordered in north, south, east, and west, and everybody is where the Lord wants them to be. The Levites know what they are supposed to do. Even the particular families of them know what they're supposed to do. We've got the number of fighting men, because that is a very important thing for the people to have confidence in, so that they will not immediately turn back and run when a threat comes. That's very important. Everything is in order. They are ready to go. Well, not quite. They still need a little more guidance before they're ready to actually get on the way. And that is what we're going to discuss next week from Numbers chapter 5 to Numbers chapter 10. They are going to have sort of a block of regulations that are going to be given to them. And hey, the Passover is celebrated in Numbers chapter 9. That's a very important thing. The Passover for the first time immediately after, the first time after they actually have left Egypt. They celebrated the Passover right after getting out of Egypt. I'm remembering that correctly, I think. They celebrated a second Passover right after Egypt. Really? Did they? I'm going to have to check that. But they celebrate the Passover in Numbers chapter 9, and a lot of other things happen, a lot of other things that the Lord tells them to do to finally get them ready to hit the road. Except there is no road because they're in the middle of a desert. So hit the sand, hit the dunes. I don't know. Say, call it what you will. But until then, let's talk about one more thing. In the beginning of the book of Numbers, there is a census taken, and it is particularly a census for counting up the fighting men of Israel. Later, in Israel's history, and I'm thinking 2 Samuel, King David, has all of the fighting men in Israel counted again, and God reprimands him for it. Why? Why did God reprimand David for it when in the book of Numbers it was totally okay? There's a few reasons. One is an obvious reason. In the book of Numbers, God commanded Moses to number the people. And for David, God didn't tell him to do that. Okay, well, fine. But, taking a census of your fighting men is a normal thing for a king to do. You have to know, you have to know what you're working with here. So why is that so bad? Another reason is the purpose for which it was done. We've already talked about the purpose for which the census in the book of Numbers was done. God obviously had his own purpose for it because nobody prompted him to command the census to be taken. He obviously had his own purpose, and the best purpose that I could think of is he wanted the people to have some confidence in their ability to see his commands through of expelling the people from the land. That was a very important thing, and you might say, well, 40 years is a long time for the population to change. Yeah, that's true, but remember, the original journey through the wilderness from Mount Sinai to the southern border of Canaan, where we're actually supposed to go in, is a 2-week walk. So population doesn't change that much in 2 weeks. So this was the number that they were supposed to be comfortable with going into the land of Canaan. So for that purpose, God said, he didn't say this, but this is the purpose. I need for these people to have some confidence in me and some confidence in their own ability to see my commands through. And so he has them numbered, and lo and behold, they are well over 500,000 fighting men. That's a big number. That's a lot of fighting men. That is more than any of their neighbors could muster. At least at that point in history, But also, I got to talk about the reason why David did it. Why would David had taken the census? Well, like I said, it was a normal thing for a king to do. You got to know what you're working with. But another common reason why kings took censuses was that they could then boast about it. They could be proud that they had so many men. And with all of these fighting men at their disposal, you can do a lot of things. You can fight a lot of people. You can take a lot of territory. You can accrue a lot of wealth because of that. And so there's a pride element involved. But finally, the third reason why it was wrong for David to do it, but not wrong when God commanded it in the book of Numbers, is this. Deuteronomy chapter 17 specifically mentions the rules that Israelite kings would have to live by. And one of those rules is, you will not acquire a military for yourself. What? You will not build up a military for yourself. Talking to the kings. They were not supposed to know what they were working with. They were not supposed to acquire a professional, like a standing military for themselves. They were not supposed to do this. And David was doing it. And so God was angry at him about it because it was actually disobeying a command from God concerning what a king was supposed to do and not do. And so that kind of answers the alleged discrepancy between Numbers and 2 Samuel with the census taking, Numbers, Moses taking the census, and God saying, and God being okay with it because he commanded him to do it. And David taking the census in 2 Samuel, and God not being okay with that. He was very angry about that. So that answers the alleged discrepancy, the alleged contradiction. It's not actually a contradiction because there are very good explanations about it. Anyway, that is how God organized his people at the foot of Mount Sinai to get them ready to leave on their way to Paran. That's the name. Paran. I'm sorry. That is the area at the southern end of Canaan through which they were supposed to enter Canaan. Paran. I need to remember that. That's an easy one. That's one of the wilderness locations. Anyway, we're going to talk about the rules and regulations that God is going to give them before they leave Mount Sinai, and also we're going to talk about them celebrating Passover and a couple of other things. Thank you for joining me for this evening. We are plumb out of time. So have a good night. God bless you all. I hope to see you Sunday morning. Goodbye.